At my son's high school graduation dinner, my parents made an announcement that shattered everything. We were at a nice steakhouse, a place my husband and I had saved up for because, despite everything, I still wanted my parents to be part of this milestone. My son, Ian, had worked incredibly hard, taking advanced classes, participating in extracurriculars, and working a part-time job. He had been accepted into his dream university, and this dinner was supposed to be a celebration. But my parents had other plans. Just as the waiter set down our drinks, my mother picked up her glass, tapped it with a fork, and stood up with a self-satisfied smile. Clearing her throat, she announced, "We have something to share. We've decided that Ian's college fund will go to his cousin Jason instead. He needs it more." Silence. I froze. My husband, Mark, tightened his grip on his fork. Ian went pale, and my younger daughter, sitting beside him, looked around in confusion. My father nodded as if this was the most reasonable decision in the world and added, "It's what's best for the family. Jason has been struggling, and this will really help him get his life back on track." Jason. My nephew. My brother's son. The boy my parents had always favored over my kids. The one they had bailed out time and time again. I felt my face flush with heat, years of biting my tongue, of letting them belittle and dismiss my children, of being treated as an afterthought compared to my brother. It all boiled over. But Mark reacted first. He leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his beer, and chuckled, a low, amused laugh. Then he said, "That's funny because we moved the fund last month." My mother blinked. My father's smile faltered. "What?" my mother snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. Mark shrugged. "Yeah, we saw this coming. So we moved Ian's college fund out of your reach weeks ago." And then everything exploded. My mother's face turned so red I thought she might pass out. "You had no right!" she shrieked. My father slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware clatter. "You can't do that. That money was meant for the family." Finally, I found my voice. "Ian is family, and that fund was his. You had no say in it." "You're selfish," my mother spat. "Jason needs this. You know how hard things have been for your brother. We're just trying to fix things for him, and you're ruining it." That's when it truly hit me. They had never intended for that money to go to Ian. Not really. They had just been waiting for the right moment to take it. I turned to Ian, who was staring at them with devastation. He had grown up knowing his grandparents didn't favor him, but this was different. This was proof that, in their eyes, he didn't even matter, and that broke something in me. "Fix things," I repeated, my voice shaking. "Like you fixed things the last time Jason stole from us? Or when he got arrested and you paid off the charges? Or when he wrecked my brother's car and you bought him a new one?" My father growled, "That's not the same. Jason has been struggling. Your brother is a single father doing his best. And I'm a mother doing my best," I shot back. "And you just told my son on one of the most important days of his life that his future doesn't matter. That you were stealing away the opportunity he worked so hard for." My mother scoffed. "Oh, please. Ian can just take out loans like everyone else." That was it. That was the moment of no return. Ian stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "You know what?" he said, his voice trembling but strong. "I don't need anything from you. I don't need your money. And I definitely don't need you in my life." Mark stood too, resting a firm hand on Ian's shoulder. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "We don't owe them another second of our time." I stood as well. "This was your last chance," I told my parents. "You've shown us who you are over and over again. But today, you made sure we'll never forget it." And with that, we walked away. They shouted after us, calling us names. But it didn't matter anymore. At first, my parents just called relentlessly, leaving furious voicemails. My mother shrieked about how we had betrayed the family. My father left angry, clipped messages saying things like, You'll regret this." Then, 2 days later, my brother finally texted, "I don't know what's going on, but Jason needs that money more than Ian. You're being selfish." That was it. No questions. No attempt to understand. Just, "You're being selfish." I didn't even bother to respond. 1 week after the graduation dinner, Mark got a call from our bank. I was in the kitchen when I heard him say, "Excuse me? What withdrawal?" I froze. My stomach dropped. The call lasted another minute or two. When Mark hung up, his face was tight with anger. "They tried to access Ian's college fund," he said, gripping the counter. "Who?" I whispered, already knowing the answer. "Your parents," he said grimly. "They called the bank pretending to be us, said we had authorized a family emergency withdrawal." I couldn't even breathe. "The bank flagged it," Mark added. "Something felt off, so they called me first." I wanted to scream. The sheer audacity, the nerve. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone, found my father's number, and called. The moment he answered, I let loose. "Did you seriously try to steal from us?" My voice shook with rage. My father didn't even sound guilty. "You left us no choice," he said flatly. "We wouldn't have had to do that if you weren't being so irrational." I nearly threw my phone across the room. "Irrational? That's fraud." "It's our money," he snapped. That stopped me cold. "What?" Then my mother's voice chimed in. "You really think you did all this alone? You think we never contributed?" My hands curled into fists. "You never put a single cent into Ian's fund." "You're remembering wrong," my father said smoothly. "And if we take this to court, I guarantee they'll agree we have a claim to it." Ice filled my veins. Mark must have seen my face because he stepped closer. "They don't have a case," he said firmly. "They have nothing to stand on." But I wasn't so sure, because my parents were good at one thing, twisting reality until they became the victims. And in a legal battle, I knew they would lie through their teeth. 3 days later, we got their answer. I was walking up our driveway when I saw a thick envelope on our porch. The return address made my stomach turn. It was from a lawyer. I ran inside, hands shaking as I ripped it open. Mark was in the living room. "What is it?" I scanned the pages. First one, second one. By the third, my hands were trembling too much to hold the papers steady. "They're suing us," I whispered. Mark's head snapped up. "What?" "They're claiming they co-financed Ian's fund, that we illegally transferred the money without their consent." My voice rose. "They're saying they own part of it." Mark stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He snatched the papers from me, eyes narrowing as he read. "This is complete bullshit," he muttered. But I wasn't so sure, because my parents were experts at manipulation, and the most terrifying part, in court, they might actually win, the proof. For the next few days, we scrambled to gather every piece of documentation we had. Bank statements, transfer records, every deposit we had ever made. And then my parents dropped their bombshell. At the next legal meeting, they presented a receipt. A single deposit from over a decade ago, $2,000, made when Ian was just a baby. They sat there smug, while their lawyer argued that because they had contributed something, they had the right to contest where the money went. $2,000? I repeated, almost laughing. "You think that gives you control over the entire fund?" My mother smiled sweetly. "It was an investment. Without it, you wouldn't have had the foundation to save as much as you did." I saw red. Luckily, Mark was calmer. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You're saying that just because you gave a one-time gift over 10 years ago, you get to decide where all of Ian's money goes?" My father nodded. "Exactly." I could have screamed. The first loss. It took weeks, but the court finally ruled that while my parents had no control over the fund, their $2,000 had to be returned, with interest, A small victory. At least they couldn't touch the rest of the money, but it still felt like a loss. Because the message was clear. My parents would go to any length to punish us for saying no, and they weren't done yet. Ungrateful, that's what they called us. They said we were destroying the family. But when I looked at my son, standing tall, despite the pain in his eyes, I knew we had done the right thing. What I didn't know was how far my parents would go to get that money back. We left that restaurant knowing things would never be the same, but I had no idea just how far my parents would go to get revenge. At first, it was just endless phone calls, voicemails from my mother screaming about how we had betrayed the family. My father left his own messages, harsh and full of anger. "You'll regret this," he said. My brother, who had stayed out of the argument that night, finally sent a text 2 days later. "I don't know what's going on, but Hassan needs that money more than Aysen. You're being selfish." That was it. No questions, no attempt to understand, just that accusation. I didn't reply. That's when the real problems started. A week after that dinner, Mark got a call from our bank. I was in the kitchen when I heard him say, "Excuse me, what withdrawal?" I froze. My stomach dropped. The call lasted another minute or two. When Mark hung up, his face was tight with anger. "They tried to access the fund," he said, gripping the counter. "Who?" "Your parents." My breath caught. They called the bank pretending to be us, said we'd given permission for an emergency family withdrawal. I could barely process it. The audacity, the sheer nerve. Without hesitation, I grabbed my phone and dialed my father. The moment he answered, I let loose. "Did you seriously just try to steal from us?" My voice shook. His reply was calm, too calm. "You left us no choice." I nearly threw my phone across the room. "No choice?" That was fraud. "It's our money," my father snapped. I almost laughed at how absurd that was. "No, it's not." "We contributed," my mother chimed in. My hands clenched into fists. "You never put a single cent into that fund." "You're remembering wrong," my father said smoothly. "And if we took this to court, I guarantee they'd agree that we have a right to it." Ice flooded my veins. Mark must have seen my face because he stepped closer. "They wouldn't win," Mark said firmly. "They have nothing to stand on." But I wasn't so sure. My parents were experts at twisting reality, playing the victims. And what terrified me most was that, in a legal battle, they might actually win. 3 days later, we got our answer. I was walking up to our house when I saw a thick envelope on our porch. The return address made my stomach churn. A lawyer. I rushed inside, hands trembling as I tore it open. Mark was in the living room. "What is it?" I scanned the first page, then the second. By the third, my hands were shaking too much to hold the paper. "They're suing us," I whispered. Mark's head snapped up. "What?" "They're claiming they co-funded Aysen's account, that we illegally transferred the money without their consent." My voice rose in disbelief. "They're saying they own part of the fund." Mark shot up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. He grabbed the papers from my hands, eyes narrowing as he read. "This is complete bullshit." But I wasn't so sure, because my parents were good at one thing, lying. And if this went to court, they just might convince someone they were the victims. We scrambled to gather every piece of documentation we could. Bank statements, transfer records, proof that we had been the only ones depositing money. And then my parents dropped their bombshell. At the next lawyer meeting, they presented a receipt. A single deposit, $2,000, from over a decade ago. They sat there, smug as their lawyer argued that because they had contributed something, anything, they had a right to dispute where the money went. "You really think that gives you control over the entire fund?" I repeated, almost laughing. My mother gave me a sweet smile. "It was a contribution. Without it, you wouldn't have had the foundation to save as much as you did." I saw red. Mark, thankfully, was calmer. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "Because you gave a one-time gift over 10 years ago, you think you get to decide where the money goes now?" My father nodded. "Exactly." I could have screamed. The first battle took weeks, but the court finally ruled that while my parents had no control over the fund, we did have to pay them back, with interest. A small victory. At least they couldn't touch the account, but it still felt like a loss. The message was clear. My parents would do anything to punish us for saying no, and they weren't done. Not even 2 weeks later, Mark walked into the house, pale as a ghost. "They reported us," he said. I blinked. "To who?" "The IRS." I stopped breathing. They told the IRS we've been hiding money, that we've been reporting funds incorrectly for years. I gripped the counter. "This is insane." Mark exhaled sharply. "Yeah, and now we're under investigation." That's when I knew this wasn't about money anymore. This was war. They weren't just trying to take our savings, they were trying to ruin us. The IRS investigation started with a cold, formal letter. Mark read it first, then handed it to me in silence. My hands shook as I skimmed it. "This can't be real," I whispered. "Oh, it's real," Mark muttered. Then came the phone call. An IRS agent, polite but firm, explaining that an anonymous tip had flagged us for fraudulent transfers and hidden assets. We knew who was behind it. Proving it? That was another story. Weeks of digging through tax records, bank statements, anything to prove our innocence. Luckily, our finances were clean, but that didn't mean the investigation was easy. The worst part? It affected Ison's college aid. His university put a hold on his scholarship funds due to the IRS review. My parents hadn't just tried to take his college fund. They tried to take his future. That was my breaking point. They wanted war? I was about to bring them hell. I started digging. My parents had secrets. I grew up watching them twist the truth, manipulate people. And if they wanted to play dirty, so could I. It didn't take long to find something interesting. Years ago, Mark had helped them set up rental property investments. He handled the paperwork, the taxes. And guess what? They had been underreporting their rental income for years. They thought they were untouchable. They weren't. I made a call. Not to the IRS. Not yet. First, I let my mother know what I'd found. "Oh," she said smugly, "so you're finally ready to apologize." I nearly laughed. "I just wanted you to know," I said, voice cold, "that I found the real tax fraud in this family." Silence. Then she scoffed. "What are you talking about?" "Your rental income, the money you've forgotten to report for 15 years. Her breath hitched. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I do. And so will the IRS unless you drop this nonsense. Now." Her tone shifted instantly. "You wouldn't." I smiled. "Try me." 2 days later, the IRS called. Our case? Suddenly not a priority. A week later, Ison's funds were unfrozen. They backed off. For now. But I knew them. This wasn't over. Not even close. He swallowed hard and looked at my mother. That was when I saw it. The guilt. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. Mark saw it too. He leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. "Tell us, Jason. Why did you think it was yours?" Jason hesitated, glancing nervously at my mother, and that was when it hit me. "Oh my God," I whispered. "They told you, didn't they?" "No." My mother flinched. I turned to Jason, my heart pounding. "They told you it was already yours, didn't they? That Ian's fund wasn't just going to you, but that it had been yours all along." Jason's eyes darted back and forth, his face pale. My mother spoke before he could. "We had to," she snapped. "He was struggling. Your brother was struggling. We had to give him hope." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you lied to him?" "You let him believe his whole future was secure, all based on money that was never his." My father finally spoke, his voice sharp. What does it matter? You had plenty. You and Mark had good jobs, a house, a stable life. Jason had nothing. What kind of sister are you sitting back while your own nephew suffered? That was it. Something inside me snapped. I took a step forward, my hands shaking. What kind of parents are you? I shot back. You had 2 children, but you spent your entire lives treating me like a second-class citizen while I pointed at my brother, who shrank under my glare, got everything handed to him. And now you expect me to just give away my son's future to clean up your mess? My mother stood abruptly. We did what we had to do. No, I spat. You did what you always do. You chose my brother over me, and this time you got caught. Silence filled the room. Jason was shaking, his face crumbling. You lied to me, he whispered, looking at my mother as if he were seeing her for the first time. Jason, she started, reaching for him, but he stepped back. Number. You promised me, he murmured, his breathing unsteady. You swore I wouldn't have to worry about school, that it was taken care of. He turned to my father. And you knew. My father's silence was answer enough. Jason let out a shaky laugh, then turned to me. I'm sorry. And for the first time in my life, I saw it. The understanding, the regret, the realization that he had been used just as much as we had been hurt. He turned and walked out. I didn't stop him. My parents tried to justify it. They complained, ranted, said I was overreacting, that I was tearing the family apart. I simply said, we're done. And this time, I meant it. My brother reached out once after that day. He apologized, admitted he had let things go too far, that he had believed our parents too much. But I wasn't ready to forgive. Jason, surprisingly, stayed out of trouble after that. He got a job, took classes at a community college. Whether it was guilt, shame, or a real wake-up call, I'll never know. But for his sake, I hoped he had finally learned. As for Ian, he went to college. His college. The one he earned. My parents never saw a cent of that money, and they never saw us again. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt. Cutting off your own parents, even ones who never truly loved you the way they should have, is like grieving. You mourn what should have been. But you know what? Sometimes it's better to bury the past than let it keep hurting you. And I chose to live.